Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming out. I'm here today to talk about ethics and nuclear weapons. And it's appropriate that we're doing this here at Georgetown University. Georgetown is famous for its School of Foreign Service, ranked by Foreign Policy magazine the #1 foreign policy school in the world. The School of Foreign Service is named after Edmund A. Walsh. And among other things, Edmund A. Walsh wrote in the 1940s about U.S. nuclear weapons and the moral importance of U.S. nuclear weapons. And that's going to be a theme of my talk today. So I consider myself an expert on nuclear issues. I don't really consider myself an expert on ethics, so I'm going to stretch a little bit. But I'm going to begin with just two ethical principles that I think we can all agree on. The first ethical principle is that it's normatively desirable to prevent large numbers of people from being slaughtered in great power war. And second ethical principle, it's normatively desirable for fewer countries to possess the world's most destructive weapons. And by those two standards, then, U.S. nuclear weapons may be one of the most important instruments for moral good on the planet. And that's the case I'm going to make today. So first, I'll talk about why I think U.S. nuclear weapons are a moral force for good. Second, I'll address a counterargument. Many people who argue that nuclear weapons are inherently immoral, the threat to use nuclear weapons is inherently immoral, and that therefore the solution is to disarm. And I'll explain why I think that is an incorrect view, and then finally I'll wrap up. So first, why are U.S. nuclear weapons moral instruments? Well, let's return to these first two moral principles. If we think it's morally desirable to prevent people from being slaughtered in great power war, then nuclear weapons have contributed to that. We've seen what international politics was like before the nuclear revolution. Before 1945, we frequently had great power wars that resulted in large-scale death and destruction. Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. 20 million people died in World War I by one estimate. 55 million people died in World War II. Since 1945, since World War II, we haven't had a great power war. 0 wars among the great powers, 0 deaths from great power war. And there are many explanations as to why this is the case. Maybe it's globalization, maybe humanity has somehow become more enlightened. But I think it's in part because of nuclear deterrence. The threat of nuclear war raised the cost of nuclear war so high, it's deterred world leaders from turning to conventional warfare as a tool of foreign policy. It's not just nuclear weapons in general, though. I think U.S. nuclear weapons are different from other countries' nuclear weapons. And the main reason that they're different is that unlike other countries, the United States does not just seek to deter nuclear attack or attack against itself. Rather, the United States extends nuclear deterrence to over 30 treaty allies around the world. The United States extends its nuclear umbrella to the 27 or 28 members of NATO, extends its nuclear umbrella to Japan, South Korea, Australia, arguably to other partners in Asia and the Middle East. And so U.S. nuclear weapons have really been essential, I think, to keeping the peace in Europe and keeping the peace in Asia since 1945. I think it's much more likely that Russia would have attacked other countries in Europe, much more likely that China would have attacked other countries in Asia, had it not been for the fear that this could lead to nuclear escalation with the United States. So U.S. nuclear weapons, the U.S. nuclear umbrella, is really responsible for defending and protecting the entire, well, not much of the free world. 30 of the best governed, wealthiest countries on Earth are protected by America's nuclear umbrella. So I think American nuclear weapons have really contributed to this great power peace in a way that other countries' nuclear weapons have not. Second moral principle, if we believe that it's desirable for fewer countries to have the most deadly weapons on Earth, then again, U.S. nuclear weapons have been an important cause of that. Because the United States engages in a pretty explicit quid pro quo with its allies and partners. We'll extend our nuclear umbrella to you to protect you from attack, but in exchange you won't build your own nuclear weapons. And if it hadn't been for this extended deterrence policy, for this assurance policy to our allies, I think there are many more countries on Earth that would have nuclear weapons today than currently do. So in the 1960s, President Kennedy predicted within 15 or so years there will be 25 nuclear powers. Here we are 60 years later, there are only 9 nuclear powers. So he vastly overpredicted how many countries would have nuclear weapons. And the reason so few countries have nuclear weapons today, a primary reason I think, is because of US nuclear nonproliferation policy. The United States has taken a lead role in establishing the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, but also with its extended deterrent commitments. It's very likely that if it weren't for these US nuclear security guarantees, that Germany, Japan, South Korea, other countries would have nuclear weapons. The United States has had to work quite hard at this over the years. Taiwan had a nuclear program in the 1970s. South Korea had a program in the 1970s. The United States encouraged them to shut down those programs, in part through this promise of protection with our own nuclear umbrella. In fact, one Taiwanese scientist in the 1970s said, by the time the Americans got through with us, I'm surprised we're still allowed to teach physics here in Taiwan. So a strong nonproliferation policy, and it's still working today. We see it in East Asia today. Actually, a majority of the South Korean population favors South Korea building its own nuclear weapons. But you talk to political leaders in South Korea, and they say as long as that US nuclear security guarantee is good, as long as the US commitment is credible, as long as the US nuclear arsenal is credible, we have no intention of building our own nuclear weapons. So again, the US nuclear umbrella has contributed to great power peace. The US nuclear arsenal has contributed to nuclear nonproliferation. I think both are morally desirable outcomes. So what's the strongest counterargument to these claims? Well, many argue that nuclear weapons are inherently evil. They're the most powerful weapons on Earth. They can unleash vast death and destruction. We saw that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there is a growing humanitarian consequences movement around the world. And the argument is essentially that nuclear weapons are so inherently destructive, the use of nuclear weapons would have such disastrous humanitarian consequences that nuclear weapons should be banned and that we should get rid of them. Others argue that even the mere threat to use nuclear weapons may be immoral, even if they're never used. Nuclear deterrence works, we think, again, by raising the cost of war in the mind of adversaries. And so you're essentially threatening the possibility of massive destruction. And some argue that that's inherently immoral, just to make the threat, even if you never have to follow through on it. And this humanitarian consequences movement has been gaining some steam recently. Actually, the United Nations General Assembly voted this summer, over 100 countries voted on a new nuclear weapons ban treaty. So this goes beyond really what's in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, probably the most successful international treaty in history, signed in the late 1960s. This ban treaty would make it illegal to possess nuclear weapons. So essentially makes the US nuclear arsenal illegal, attempts to make it illegal under international law. Now it's worth pointing out that unlike the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, none of the existing nuclear powers signed this nuclear ban treaty, and none of the 30-plus US treaty allies who depend on America's nuclear arsenal for their own security signed this ban treaty. So it's not binding on countries that don't sign, and I think takes us away from more practical approaches. So what does this kind of humanitarian consequence, this ban movement, overlook? Well, I think it overlooks a few things. One, the point of US nuclear weapons isn't to fight a nuclear war. If the United States conducts its nuclear strategy correctly, nuclear deterrence policy correctly, it deters war without using nuclear weapons. And in fact, if it comes to the point that you have to follow through on your threats and use nuclear weapons, then your policy has failed. The entire point is not to use them. Second, this is a little-known point. I think many people learn about nuclear deterrence in their Intro to International Relations courses in college. This kind of simple model of mutually assured destruction, that we threaten to completely destroy Russia, they threaten to completely destroy us, and so therefore neither one of us engages in warfare. But actually, US nuclear strategy and targeting policy is very different from other countries. So other countries have intentionally adopted strategies that do aim, in the event of a nuclear strike, in the event of a nuclear exchange, to try to inflict mass casualties. We believe China's nuclear strategy is aimed primarily at targeting U.S. population centers, killing as many Americans as possible if it comes to the point of using nuclear weapons. Russia, in particular the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we now know that their nuclear strategy was essentially to launch a full-scale nuclear attack and then to follow it up with a massive biological weapons attack against the United States to make sure that they killed anybody who survived the nuclear attack. If you survive the nuclear attack, they'll get you with the biological attack. The United States, on the other hand, attempts to follow the laws of war with its nuclear targeting strategy. And so this is made very clear in the nuclear employment guidance, most recently from President Obama, that the United States does not intentionally target civilians. The United States only targets legitimate military targets, the enemy's nuclear weapons, enemy military facilities. Now, of course, if it comes to nuclear use, there would be serious collateral damage and other effects, and I don't want to minimize that, but there is, I think, a difference between how the United States thinks about these weapons, again, only for use against military targets, an attempt to minimize collateral damage, and the way our opponents think about these weapons, which is to kill as many people as possible. So what about the argument that these things are just so devastating, we'd be better off without them, we should get rid of them? And this is a theme we see often in U.S. policy. There's something of a tension in U.S. policy, and we've seen that with our past two presidents. President Obama called for nuclear zero, called for a world without nuclear weapons, but he said in the meantime, the United States needs to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. Donald Trump used different words, but basically said the same thing. Donald Trump said, it would be great, it would be a dream if no country had nuclear weapons, but as long as countries have nuclear weapons, the United States is going to be at the top of the pack. So both, on one hand, expressing a desire for a robust nuclear deterrent, and at the same time expressing this goal of elimination. And the United States in Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty explicitly signed up to the idea that all states should pursue negotiations in good faith toward complete nuclear disarmament and complete general disarmament. I think there is a fair question to be asked, though, is would the elimination of nuclear weapons truly be desirable? Would it be preferable to a world with nuclear weapons? And we don't know, but we do know that pre-1945 we saw a lot of warfare and a lot of bloodshed. Since 1945 we haven't seen any great power war. It's possible that the elimination of nuclear weapons could make the world safe again for conventional aggression. Maybe conventional weapons alone would be enough to deter great power war, but it had never been sufficient in the past. So an open question about whether nuclear disarmament is desirable. I think an even more difficult question is it feasible? And I think the simple answer is that, and given current conditions, it's not feasible. So I think the Obama administration made a good faith effort to try to bring about this world without nuclear weapons. The United States, under Obama, tried to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. The United States reduced the size of its nuclear arsenal. Side fact here, in 1967, the United States had 31,255 nuclear weapons. Under the New START treaty signed with Russia, we reduced that to 1,550, so 1/30 or so of the nuclear weapons we had at the height of the Cold War. And so the Obama administration announced its intention to go further. It said it was willing to reduce to 1,000 nuclear weapons. And the idea behind the Obama administration nuclear strategy was essentially that the United States would play a leadership role, that other countries would follow suit. That if we reduced reliance, other countries, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, would follow our lead. So we tried this experiment and it didn't work. Other countries went in the exact opposite direction. The United States reduced reliance and other countries expanded and modernized their arsenal. So over the past 8 years, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, all expanded and modernized their nuclear forces. Several of them, including Russia, North Korea, and Pakistan in particular, rely more, not less, on nuclear weapons in their strategy than they did just a few years ago. And so I think what happened is that countries saw an opportunity. If the United States is not going to seriously compete in this space, that this is their asymmetric advantage. If Americans are afraid of nuclear weapons, they're going to rely more on nuclear weapons as a way to coerce us and our allies. So I think the United States trying to unilaterally disarm is not a solution. And I think it gets cause and effect wrong, and this will be my concluding point. I think the problem is not the weapons themselves, it's actually the security conditions that cause countries to want nuclear weapons in the first place. And this is something that President Ronald Reagan understood. Reagan said in the 1980s, quote, "We don't fear each other because we're armed because we fear each other." And I think what we've seen since the end of the Cold War is that the United States has reduced its nuclear arsenal, has focused on the hardware, has reduced the hardware, and it hasn't led to a more peaceful world. If anything, in recent years, I think we've seen more conflict, more risk of great power war, Russia invading Ukraine, China becoming more aggressive in the South China Sea. And so I think we can still hold out this hope of eventual nuclear disarmament, but I think the key is not the United States getting rid of hardware, it's rather addressing the security conditions that cause countries to desire nuclear weapons in the first place. And so eliminating those security threats, eliminating the reasons that countries want nuclear weapons will not be easy, but I think it really is that kind of radical transformation that will be necessary to get rid of nuclear weapons. And in the meantime, I think a robust U.S. nuclear arsenal will continue to be a moral force for good, as it has been for the past 70 years. So I'll end my remarks there and look forward to question and answer. Thank you. This was the first hand I saw in the tan suit.
Thank you so much for that presentation. My name is Manuel Tangana. My question is, from your perspective in this era of nuclear, many of us are on the hype of the global terrorism. So between Islamic terrorism, China, Russia, North Korea, where do you think is the greatest threat in the long term for the United States?
Yeah. Nuclear war with Russia is still the only threat on Earth that could mean the end of the United States as a functioning society. So I still think that that's the greatest nuclear national security threat on Earth, large-scale nuclear war with Russia. Of course, it's unlikely, but it's become more likely in the past few years than it has been at any time in the past 25 years. As I mentioned, Russia is relying more, not less, on nuclear weapons in its strategy. And they've been modernizing and expanding their nuclear arsenal, even building new nuclear weapons that they never had, nobody had during the Cold War, including a nuclear-armed submarine drone. The idea is that it would pull up into harbors in the United States undetected and detonate. In addition, as I said, Russia is relying more on nuclear weapons. It has this escalate to de-escalate strategy. And basically the idea is if they get into a conflict with the United States or NATO, they suspect that we don't have the guts for nuclear war, but they do. So they'll use nuclear weapons, a small number of nuclear weapons early in the conflict in order to force us to back down and sue for peace on terms favorable to them. So I do see a plausible path to nuclear exchange with Russia, which is what if Russia does to a NATO ally, to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, what it did to Ukraine. Well, this time it's with a U.S. ally. I don't think the United States could stay out of this fight. We'd have to come to the defense of our allies. And I think it could be a difficult fight, especially if Russian forces were already dug in, but that given NATO's aggregate superiority, we would eventually win. And at this point, I think Russia would likely use a small number of nuclear weapons to try to deter us into backing down and to try to win the war. And so then what do you do if you're the United States president? Do you back down to avoid any further risk of nuclear war, knowing that it could mean the collapse of NATO, knowing that it could invite further Russian aggression in Europe? Or do you retaliate with nuclear weapons? So unfortunately, I think there is a real path to nuclear war with Russia. Again, don't want to exaggerate it, but the probability is greater than zero. But there are other threats, as you pointed out, danger that terrorists could acquire nuclear weapons. I think that risk is much less now than it was in 2001 because the United States and our partners have taken a number of efforts around the world to secure nuclear material. You know, most people think that if a terrorist acquired nuclear weapons, it's likely that they would use them. So deterrence is probably a less effective strategy for terrorists than it is with states. So rather, the key with nuclear terrorism is locking up the nuclear material, making it difficult for terrorists to acquire nuclear material or nuclear weapons in the first place. There still is a risk. I think there's unsecured, or at least weapons that we have concerns about in some countries, Pakistan, Russia, and others. But over the past 16 years, as I pointed out, we have made great efforts to try to lock up nuclear material. North Korea, of course, is the threat that's in the news today. And North Korea kind of, one of the trends we see in nuclear strategy is that conventionally weaker powers often rely on early nuclear escalation as a way to try to counter conventional superiority. And so I think North Korea also has this idea that it could use nuclear weapons early in a conflict with the United States and try to force us to back down. For 25 years, we didn't really worry about these things. We thought they were Cold War relics. Unfortunately, I think we've entered a second nuclear age, and these are going to be an important part of U.S. foreign policy going forward. So,
I guess my follow-up question on that one is in regard to North Korea, China, and Russia. And with what is going on right now, North Korea and the U.S., you think it would be a good judgment for the U.S., if a need be, to engage North Korea with a war? If we're not sure of China's backing U.S.'s involvement in North Korea and Russia's backing U.S. in this effort, I would like to hear about your perspective in this regard about North Korea-U.S. situation currently.
Yeah. Well, we have no good options with North Korea, and so I think the art of foreign policy is often choosing the least bad option, and I think that's true today. I think war with North Korea is not a good option because we believe that, North Korea is only the third U.S. adversary after Russia and China that has the ability to threaten nuclear war against the U.S. homeland. I think many people think, well, there are a lot of countries out there with nuclear weapons, India, Britain, France. But in terms of potential adversaries that have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons to U.S. soil, North Korea is now only the third. So that's a serious threat. They also have the ability to deliver nuclear weapons against our allies in the region, U.S. forces in the region. And even before they acquired nuclear weapons, of course, they had a lot of conventional artillery on the Kaesong Heights that they could have used to attack U.S. forces and allies in Seoul. So war is not a good option. Diplomacy hasn't worked in the past, and the North Koreans, Russia and China put forward some diplomatic solutions, and the North Koreans have dismissed them out of hand. So I think our least bad option at this point is to have a strategy with two major elements. And the first element is a coercive diplomacy element to try to increase the economic, political, military pressure on North Korea. I don't think it'll pay off in the short term, but I think over time this could increase the pressure enough that they'd be willing to come to the table and discuss denuclearization. And then second, in the meantime, part one may never work, and it will certainly take time. So the second element needs to be a serious defensive and deterrent policy for us and our allies. And so I think that includes strengthened missile defenses in the region, but also homeland missile defenses. So a defensive component, but also an offensive component. Because the United States needs credible military options, because even if we don't want war, the enemy gets a vote. And so if North Korea attacks, we have to have credible options for responding. So I think when Trump and other administration officials say that there are credible military options, I don't think they're talking about launching a first strike. I think it's about being prepared to respond in case North Korea attacks. And if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, I think we can all agree that we would want to physically prevent them from using a second or a third or a fourth. And so I think our military options would have to be geared toward that disarming mission. And for years, the United States has threatened that the Kim regime wouldn't be allowed to survive if it used nuclear weapons. So working with our regional allies, in particular the South Koreans, I think we need to have a serious military planning toward those kind of scenarios as well. In the front here.
Thanks for your talk, for the clarity of it and the systematic nature of it. I wonder if I might present you with an ethical trilemma and see what you think. Thanks. So it seems to me that Christian
just war ethics historically have been committed to non-consequentialist reasoning. There are certain things we just won't do no matter how conducive they are to the success in warfaring. And I wonder if, so the first option seems to be, A, you reject that thinking, particularly since nuclear weapons seem to violate the principle of non-combatant immunity. Or two, we should maintain the principle of non-combatant immunity, and that's a truly viable option moving forward in the sort of nuclear landscape. If two, I wonder if you can give examples of how that might work, namely that we can maintain the use of nuclear weapons, credible threat of nuclear weapons, without endangering large-scale civilian populations. Or three, that we ought to maintain Christian just war thinking, and concomitantly, we ought to maintain the non-combatant immunity principle, and therefore, number three, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not permissible according to Christian just war teaching. So this seems to me like the argument of Elizabeth Anscombe. So I wonder which one you might think. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I'm more of an expert on nuclear weapons than I am about ethics or just war theory. So, I look forward to a further discussion on this. But, first thing I would say is that the United States does try to abide by the non-combatant immunity principle and by the laws of war in its nuclear targeting, which is different from the way the Russians and the Chinese think about it. So again, the United States doesn't purposely target civilians or non-combatants, only targets legitimate military targets, and then there, of course, would be collateral damage from that. So this gets to a second point, which is there is a debate in the United States today about how do we modernize our nuclear forces. How many of you have cars? Probably most of you. How many of you have cars that were built in the 1960s and the 1970s? Probably none of you. If you did, would you get in and turn the key and expect it to start every time? Probably not. Well, the U.S. nuclear arsenal was essentially built in the 60s, 70s. Our new stuff was built in the 80s. So it's aging. It needs to be modernized. President Obama won bipartisan support for plans to modernize the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years at a price tag of $1 trillion over those 30 years. Sounds like a lot, but it comes to about 5% of the U.S. defense budget. So is 5% of the defense budget too much to spend on protecting the free world? I don't think so, but reasonable people can disagree. But one of the questions that's coming up now with the Trump administration, Trump has called for a nuclear arsenal at the top of the pack, which isn't that different historically. It's different from what Obama said, because he said he was going to get rid of them. But John Kennedy in 1963 said the United States should have a nuclear arsenal, quote, second to none. So pretty consistent. And so there is a debate, I think, in the Trump administration about whether we just do the Obama modernization plan that was set in place in 2010 when it was a much more benign security environment, or now, given that we face these new nuclear threats from Russia, North Korea, and others, do we need to augment that plan a little bit? And one of the places where there's been a desire for possible change is to go toward lower yield warheads. And there'd be a number of advantages to doing this, but one of them is to minimize collateral damage even further. A lot of our nuclear weapons in the Cold War were built with certain scenarios in mind, that we were going to try to destroy hardened Russian ballistic missile silos, which requires a large yield. But if some of the scenarios we're talking about now wouldn't require that large of a yield, so you could go to a smaller yield, still accomplish the military mission, but greatly reduce collateral damage. And so I think even more consistent with just war theory, reducing even further the risk to non-combatants. There was actually an article about this in Politico that was, said something about Trump wants mini nukes, and then they kind of had I think an unfair kind of spin on the article that this was somehow dangerous. But I see it exactly the opposite, that it would be desirable for ethical reasons. But I also think it would strengthen deterrence. If a U.S. president could threaten to use nuclear weapons without killing large numbers of people or killing fewer people, again, I think that just strengthens deterrence, makes the threat to use nuclear weapons more credible. Yes.
I'm Brian Mason, George Mason. I have two questions to follow up on the North Korea situation. The first question regards China. I would have thought that China would be extremely concerned about North Korea's nuclear capabilities, but thus far they don't seem to have demonstrated that much concern. One explanation is they don't want to do anything until their 19th five-year Congress is over, and maybe once Xi's confirmed for the next 5 years, they'll toughen up. But so it's the question about China's reaction seems a little peculiar. My second question is, I would think that in both South Korea and Japan, that as long as we leave North Korea's arsenal undisturbed and in effect allow them to continue to strengthen it, I would think there'd be growing a sense in both South Korea and Japan, well, it's all very nice to have this U.S. nuclear shield, but these guys are awfully close and the U.S. is awfully far away, and maybe we ought to start looking after our own nuclear capabilities. So 2 follow-ups on North Korea.
Yeah, great questions. So first on China and how do we explain China's role in the North Korea crisis? So I think the major problem here is that for us, for the United States and our partners, the nuclear and missile issue is the #1 priority with North Korea, maybe the #1 most urgent national security priority facing the country right now. For China, it's priority number 4 or 5. You know, for them, most important is actually making sure that North Korea continues to exist. They're afraid that if the country collapses, they could have refugee flows coming across the border, which would be problematic for them. They're also afraid that if they put too much pressure on North Korea collapses, that the peninsula could reunify under South Korean leadership, aligned with the United States, that there would be U.S. forces right on their border. So they, I think, would prefer that North Korea not have the nuclear and missile program, but they worry even more about these other issues. And so I think that explains the pattern over the past few years, which China will put some sanctions on North Korea, agree to them at the UN, be kind of half-hearted in their enforcement of the sanctions, actually try to water down the sanctions before they're passed in the UN. And so they go to the United States and the rest of the world and say, we're doing something about this. But they're not willing to do enough, and I don't think they'll ever be willing to do enough because, again, it's not in their interest to really destabilize the country. So I think the solution is secondary sanctions. And the Trump administration actually announced on Wednesday, or I guess last Wednesday, Trump gave Treasury wide authority to go after any foreign bank doing business with North Korea. So I think there's a misperception out there that North Korea is under a lot of sanctions. You know, compared to what we did to Iran, we've barely gotten started with North Korea. So what we did with Iran that was very effective were these secondary sanctions. So essentially what we did is we weren't sanctioning Iran directly. We essentially made a threat to the rest of the world. Banks and firms in Europe, banks and firms in Asia. If you do business with Iran, we'll sanction you. And if you do business with an entity that does business with Iran, we'll sanction you. And so it basically forced them to choose, would you rather buy cheap Iranian gas and oil, or would you rather have access to the U.S. market, the largest, most diverse market on earth, access to the U.S. stock exchange, be able to do business in the dollar? And so really that's not a choice at all. They chose to remain in U.S. Treasury's good graces and cut off ties with Iran. We've just started really secondary sanctions against North Korea. Again, last Wednesday, Trump gave Treasury broad authority. The same day, I think not by coincidence, China announced that it was going to bar its banks from doing business with North Korea. And I think that was an effort to save face. They knew their banks were going to choose to start to cut off trade with North Korea because of the threat of U.S. secondary sanctions. So we'll see what happens. It will take time, but I suspect we can greatly increase the economic pressure on North Korea through these secondary sanctions and bypass the Chinese government and work directly on the pocketbook of these North Korean or of these Chinese banks. And the second question, remind me.
The second question was, I would think eventually pressure in both South Korea and Japan
yeah.
nuclear forces would grow.
Yeah, so the question is, will Japan and South Korea build their own nuclear weapons? So both countries have considered the nuclear option in the past. I think South Korea more seriously than North Korea. The United States worked to persuade them not to build nuclear weapons. But now as the North Korean threat grows, they're reconsidering, especially the South Koreans. And it makes sense that they would reconsider because a couple of years ago, the United States could threaten to fight a nuclear war with North Korea, and there would be no cost to the U.S. homeland directly. As North Korea gets the ability to construct ICBMs capable of reaching territorial United States, then a US president has to make the calculation, are you willing to fight a nuclear war in South Korea if it means Americans dying on the continental United States? Are we willing to trade Seoul for New York? To kind of paraphrase the Cold War saying, are we really willing to trade New York for Paris? And so you can understand why our allies might question that. Would a US president really be willing to come to their defense? And so they are reconsidering. As I pointed out, the South Korean government has asked the United States to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil. So during the Cold War, the US had kind of battlefield nuclear weapons on the ground in South Korea. We pulled them out at the end of the Cold War. The South Koreans are now asking us to bring them back. And they're also, some of them are saying if the United States is unwilling to do that, maybe South Korea should build its own nuclear weapons. As I pointed out in my remarks, the majority of the South Korean population now favors building their own nuclear weapons. And the Japanese are not talking like this right now, but they've considered nuclear weapons in the past. It's possible they could reconsider in the future. So I think this also needs to be an important part of American strategy toward North Korea, not just deterring North Korea, but assuring our allies and preventing them from taking steps that, like building their own nuclear arsenals, that might not be in our interest. So I don't think we need to redeploy nuclear weapons back to South Korea yet. I think there's actually a lot we can do in between that space that would go toward reassuring them. So Obama said that we still have tactical nuclear weapons forward deployed in Europe. And so the Obama Nuclear Posture Review said we'll have forward deployed nuclear weapons in Europe, and our nuclear weapons will be deployable to Asia. In a crisis or in a war, we'd have the ability to bring nuclear weapons back to Asia. But the Obama administration never really did anything to make that real. And so I think the Trump administration could do some things to make it clear that our nuclear weapons are deployable in Asia. We can refurbish nuclear weapons storage areas in the region. We can exercise dual-capable, nuclear-capable fighters, and do other things to show the South Koreans and the Japanese that we're serious about this extended deterrence mission. So that would be my recommendation as a first step. Because I do think the United States, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, has an interest in preventing other countries from building the world's most dangerous weapons. All the way in the back in the black top.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, one of the students from the King's College. So given that the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe are rather old and some would say possibly non-functional, can you give me an idea of what their strategic value in Europe still is, or really has that value depreciated, or will it depreciate in the future?
Yeah. No, so during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union both had thousands of nuclear weapons in Europe. Some of the stuff we have, people probably wouldn't even believe. We had torpedoes, depth charges, shorter range artillery, nuclear artillery. At the end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush and I guess it was the Soviet leader at the time signed these presidential nuclear initiatives. They agreed to get rid of all these tactical nuclear weapons. The United States did so. We got rid of everything except 200 gravity bombs in Europe. So we have these 200 gravity bombs in bases in Europe that can be delivered by fighter aircraft, F-15s, F-16s, the F-35 eventually. The Russians kept everything. So the Russians still have nuclear torpedoes, nuclear depth charges, nuclear short-range missiles. They're cheating on arms control agreements. They've built a new intermediate-range nuclear-capable missile. They have surface-to-air nuclear-armed missiles for air defenses. So to come after, when we do missile defense, we basically try to hit a bullet with a bullet. We have a conventional missile interceptor trying to hit the incoming missile. The Russians just put nuclear weapons on top of their interceptors. So they send the nuclear weapon up, detonate it. You don't have to be as accurate if you're detonating a nuke at an incoming missile. But they also plan to use it for air defense. So if there are NATO aircraft coming in, use surface-to-air nuclear missiles against aircraft. And that's one of the things that I think is leading Russia to this escalate to de-escalate strategy. They see that they have thousands of these battlefield nuclear weapons that they could use to great effect against NATO conventional forces, and we don't have really much of an ability to respond. We have these 200 gravity bombs. which would require us basically flying directly over the target and dropping the bomb. And in addition, Russia has very sophisticated air defenses. And so the idea that we could get a fighter aircraft directly over the target in the face of these Russian air defenses is just unrealistic. So I think this is one of the things the Trump administration is likely considering in this nuclear posture review. You know, if we go toward a more flexible nuclear posture, if we go to smaller yield weapons, are there things we could do in Europe? And I've written on this. You know, I think what would be best is instead of these B-61 gravity bombs to have surface-to-air cruise missiles, nuclear-armed cruise missiles, because they could penetrate Russian air defenses. And again, the point isn't to fight a limited nuclear war in Russia, it's to show Putin that we have a response. He can't use a nuclear weapon or two and win a war. It's just going to lead to more nuclear escalation, again, to deter him from going down that road in the first place. Yeah, the red tie.
Thank you for the talk. Josh Hasty. Josh Hasty, Old Dominion University. Thank you for the talk, and especially the strong case against the disarmament movement and the strategic value of nuclear weapons. I'm curious if you could talk about why you don't go as far as the late Ken Waltz, right, with the more may be better argument that he made a couple of times, but most recently, right, with the Iranian deal, where he argues that he makes a stability argument, but goes so far as to say that further proliferation leads to further stability. And can you talk about why you don't go quite that far?
Yeah. So Kenneth Waltz was perhaps the most influential international relations professor of the past 50 years or so, most famous for his theory of international politics, which was published in the late 1970s. But in addition to this, he wrote about nuclear weapons proliferation. He argued that the spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries was a good thing because they raise the cost of war, because they deter war, that the more countries with nuclear weapons, the better. And in fact, if every country had nuclear weapons, we'd have world peace because the cost of war would be too high. So the reason I disagree with that is I think there's a difference between U.S. nuclear weapons and other countries' nuclear weapons. I don't think Russia's nuclear weapons are making the world safer, as I've talked about. I don't think North Korea's nuclear weapons are making the world safer. I don't think Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, because in order for nuclear deterrence to work, there has to be a risk of nuclear war. That's what frightens leaders. And so there was a logical contradiction in Waltz's argument. You know, the risk of nuclear war is either zero or not zero, but he was trying to have it both ways. He said, we don't have to worry about the spread of nuclear weapons because they'll never be used because the cost is too high, and they'll deter war because people will be so afraid of nuclear war, there won't be wars. So he's essentially saying it's high enough to deter war, but it's not so high that we have to worry that they'll be used, and it's just a contradiction. So my view is that there is a real risk of nuclear war. We're seeing that again with Russia and North Korea. You know, even President Kennedy, who I don't think any of us thought was crazy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis said the risk of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. You know, so Kennedy was willing to run a 50% chance of nuclear war with the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. And so if that's the case, what risk of nuclear war is Putin or Kim Jong-un willing to run over conflicts in their regions? And I think the answer is greater than zero, which means there is a real risk of nuclear use. Yes, in the white shirt.
Joe Elias, an alumnus from MSB. So a lot of questions that are coming to my mind have been asked, but I have two. The first one, what is the likelihood of nuclear weapons of the right order getting in the hands of ISIS? Mm-hmm. And the second one is, so it is my perception that we went after Iran from an economic sanctions perspective a little harsher than we did with our North Korean friends. Is that true? And if so, why did we do that? Your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'll take the second question first. So, you know, I think really that decision was made in the Obama administration. You know, they had to decide what they were going to prioritize. They decided to prioritize Iran, and I think it was because North Korea conducted its first test in 2006. I think the Obama administration calculated that that horse had already left the barn. It's going to be hard to put the toothpaste back in the bottle. better to focus on Iran, where we still had a chance of stopping them. And so they really did make the Iran nuclear issue a priority for many years. And, you know, as we got our first UN Security Council resolution on Iran in 2005, it wasn't really until 2012 or 13 that the sanctions really started to bite. And then 2015, we got the deal. So I think, you know, going back to North Korea and trying this pressure track makes sense. Our Asian friends said that if we had focused as much on North Korea as we had on Iran, we might not be in this situation today, and they may be right. But you know, given the dangers of living with a nuclear North Korea, I think it's worth a shot of kind of trying to replay the Iran dual-track sanctions negotiation strategy from the Iranian case to the North Korean case. I'm not confident it'll work, but I think it's worth a shot. The risk of ISIS acquiring nuclear weapons, you know, it's actually pretty difficult to produce weapons-grade fissile material. You know, Iran started its uranium enrichment program in 1987. It wasn't until early 2000s that it was actually enriching uranium. So we don't have to worry about terrorists building their own nuclear weapons. The real danger is that if they could steal nuclear weapons, or if they could have a country sell them nuclear weapons. I think the risk that a country would give or sell terrorist nuclear weapons is very low. It's never happened historically. And the United States has a deterrence policy against this, starting with National Security Advisor Steve Hadley under President Bush. The United States has consistently announced that we would hold responsible state sponsors of nuclear terror. You know, so if Pakistan or Russia or somebody gave nuclear weapons to terrorists and those nuclear weapons were used, we would hold the state sponsor accountable. So to try to use our nuclear deterrence policy to deter transfer. So there is some danger that a terrorist could, you know, steal or seize nuclear weapons in Pakistan or Russia or somewhere else. But I think that risk is pretty low. You know, my friends who really focus on Pakistan's nuclear weapons say, you know, the good news is nuclear weapons are the safest thing in Pakistan. The bad news is that nuclear weapons are the safest thing in Pakistan. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Beth.
All right. Thank you.